Welcome to True Crime Tuesday, where the truth is scarier than fiction. Each week, we dive deep into the darkest corners of human nature, exploring real-life crime cases, unsolved mysteries, and infamous killers. From chilling disappearances to horrifying serial crimes, these stories are as disturbing as they are true. So if you think you can handle the horror, stay tuned, because some of these cases are so terrifying, you may not sleep tonight. The morning of June 9th, 1912, dawned bright and clear over the railroad town of Villisca, Iowa. Church bells rang out across the community, calling its residents to worship as they had done every Sunday for generations. None could have known that this ordinary day would end in a night of unimaginable horror. A crime so brutal, it would haunt the town for more than a century. In the Moore family home, Josiah and Sarah moved about their morning routine, preparing their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, for Sunday services. That same morning, sisters Lena and Ina Stillinger received permission from their older sister, Blanche, to spend the night at the Moores after the Presbyterian Church's Children's Day program. It would be the last permission Blanche would ever grant her younger sisters. As the morning light filtered through the curtains of the Moore family home, Sarah called up the stairs to her children. "Hurry now, we don't want to be late for Sunday school." The floorboards creaked overhead as the children stirred from their beds, their voices echoing through the modest 2-story house. None of them could possibly imagine that in less than 24 hours, these same walls would bear witness to an act of savagery that would shock the nation. The final day, hour by hour. By 6:30 a.m., the town was already stirring. Henry N. Arson called Reverend Ewing to arrange lodging for visiting minister, Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly. The small, peculiar man with intense eyes would later become a person of interest in the horrific events that would unfold. At 8 a.m., Joseph Stillinger watched from his field as his daughters Lena and Ina walked toward town for Sunday school, their dresses swaying in the morning breeze. It was the last time he would see his daughters alive. Joseph Stillinger raised his hand to shield his eyes from the morning sun as he watched his daughters disappear down the dusty road toward town. Something made him linger, watching until they were completely out of sight. Years later, he would recall this moment with agonizing clarity. The last glimpse of his beloved daughters walking away from him forever. A day of worship and preparation. The day progressed with the rhythm typical of a small town Sunday life. Church bells rang at 9:30 a.m., calling the faithful to worship. Alice Willard sat on her front porch, enjoying the bright, sunny morning. Mrs. Glattmeyer prepared for the morning program at the Methodist Church, while the Peckham family walked to their Christian church. By 10 a.m., Sunday school had begun at both the Presbyterian and Methodist churches. The Moore family attended the Presbyterian church, where later that day, Sarah would help prepare the children for the evening's special Children's Day program. The Moore children sat attentively in their Sunday best, hands folded in their laps as they recited their verses. Catherine, the eldest daughter, had been practicing her parts for weeks. Later that afternoon, she would join Lena and Ina Stillinger for rehearsals, their young voices filling the church with hymns of praise. The sanctuary echoed with their innocent laughter, unaware that death was watching, waiting, biding its time. Afternoon activities. As afternoon arrived, the town continued its peaceful Sunday routine. At 2 p.m., Mrs. Ewing, Sarah Moore, and Miss Huggis worked with the children on their special service, drilling them until 4 p.m. The Stillinger girls rehearsed alongside the Moore children, all excited for the evening's performance. Meanwhile, at 3 p.m., Reverend Kelly preached at the schoolhouse in nearby Arlington. His sermon that day would later be scrutinized for hidden meanings and possible confessions. Throughout the afternoon, various townspeople noted strangers in their midst. Mrs. Glattmeyer observed a man looking over houses along her street. Was this merely a visitor or someone with more sinister intentions? As shadows lengthened across Villisca's streets, Mrs. Glattmeyer's skin prickled with an unease. "Get up and see what is the matter with that man," she called to her husband. The stranger moved methodically, his eyes scanning each house as if committing every detail to memory. By the time Mr. Glattmeyer reached the window, the man had vanished. "You are too late," his wife said. "He has just gone out of sight to the north." Neither of them could have known that death was already walking among them, selecting its victims with calculated precision. The evening hours, a community gathering. As evening approached, the Moore family visited Josiah's parents, as this was their Sunday custom. Around 6 p.m, Joe Moore called Blanche Stillinger, asking if Lena and Ina could stay the night. The girls were afraid to walk to their grandmother's in the dark, and Blanche readily agreed. Mary Peckham, the Moore's neighbour, recalls seeing the Stillinger girls at the Moore house and learning they would be staying the night. This casual conversation would later haunt her, as she became one of the first to discover the horrific scene the next morning. As twilight descended on Villisca, the air grew heavy with humidity. Mary Peckham nodded a greeting to the Stillinger girls as they carried milk jugs between houses. "Staying with the Moores tonight?" she asked. The girls nodded excitedly, chattering about the evening's programme. Mary smiled, watching them disappear into the Moore house. The simple exchange would replay in her mind countless times in the days to come, as she wondered if she could have somehow prevented what was about to unfold. The church service. At 7:30 p.m, Mary Peckham observed the Moore family walk into church. The house had recently been released from quarantine for smallpox, marking the second time it had been under such restrictions. By 8 p.m, church bells rang, signalling the beginning of service. The Presbyterian church was filled to capacity for the Children's Day programme, which began slightly behind schedule. Reverend Wesley Ewing sat behind Sarah Moore and noted that Joe Moore was seated on the north side of the church, 2 or 3 seats from the rear. The church pews creaked under the weight of the congregation as hymns filled the air. Catherine Moore stood before the assembly, reciting her memorized verses without a single mistake. Sarah beamed with pride from her seat, while Joe watched attentively from the back. The Stillinger girls sang with voices clear as bells, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of oil lamps. None of them knew that these would be their final moments of public performance, that their voices would soon be silenced forever. The return home. Between 9 and 10 p.m, the Children's Day programme concluded. The Moore family remained after the service to prepare flower bouquets for the sick. Sarah planned to deliver one to a family across the street from their home. 14-year-old Eveline Curtis and her family walked the Moore family and the Stillinger girls out of the church, bidding them good night. "I think we were the last to see them alive," Eveline would later recall, her voice trembling with the weight of this knowledge. Young Floyd and Orville Watt accompanied the Moores and Stillinger girls to the Moore house. The boys observed Joe taking a key from his pocket to unlock the door as the house was dark. One of the little girls mentioned seeing a man behind a tree, a detail that would later send chills down investigators' spines. The night was unusually dark as the Moore family and their guests made their way home. The town street lights had failed to come on at dusk, leaving the paths shrouded in shadow. One of the little girls suddenly clutched Catherine's hand. "I think I see someone behind the tree," she whispered, pointing to a large oak. The others peered into the darkness but saw nothing. Joel Moore dismissed it with a gentle laugh. "Just shadows playing tricks," he assured them. As they reached the house, Joe produced a key and unlocked the door. The home was dark and silent, awaiting their return. The boys said their goodbyes and turned to leave, watching as the Moore family and their guests disappeared into the house. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. The night of horror, midnight to dawn. Between midnight and 2 a.m. on June the 10th, 1912, an unspeakable evil descended upon the Moore household. While the family slept, a killer, or killers, moved methodically through the home, attacking each victim with an axe taken from the Moore's own coal shed. That's cold. The murder began in the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah Moore were struck with such force that their faces were unrecognizable. The killer then moved to the children's room, ensuring no witnesses would remain. Finally, the Stillinger girls, sleeping in the downstairs bedroom, met the same gruesome fate. The house stood silent under the moonless sky as the killer moved from room to room. The axe rose and fell with terrible precision, each blow striking with enough force to shatter bone. Blood spattered the walls and ceilings, soaking into the bed sheets and floorboards. The victims, deep in sleep, had no chance to cry out or flee. The murderer worked methodically, covering each victim's face with bedclothes after the deed was done. An oil lamp, its chimney removed, provided just enough light to see by. When the killing was complete, the murderer extinguished all lamps, plunging the house into darkness once more. The dark hour. As the Moore family and their guests lay dead in their beds, life in Villisca continued unaware. Mike Overman, the night watchman, made his rounds through the town, passing within blocks of the murder scene. He reported hearing nothing unusual that night. Meanwhile, Reverend Kelly claimed to have heard strange noises from his room at the Ewing house, what he would later describe as the thud of an axe. Did he truly hear the murders taking place, or was this a fabrication designed to implicate himself? While blood still dripped from the beds to the floor in the Moore house, Mike Overman walked his beat through Villisca's empty streets. The night was unusually quiet, the darkness profound. He passed within a stone's throw of the Moore home, unaware that just beyond those walls lay 8 victims of the most horrific crime the town would ever know. In his room at the Ewing house, Reverend Kelly stood on the balcony, his thin frame silhouetted against the night sky. He would later claim to have heard something, a rhythmic thudding that sent chills down his spine. Was it his imagination or the sound of death at work? The killer's lingering presence. After committing the murders, the killer did not immediately flee. Evidence suggested that the murderer remained in the house for some time, perhaps hours. Investigators would later discover that the killer had, number 1, covered all the mirrors in the house with clothing. 2, covered the victims' faces with bedclothes. 3, left a piece of keyhole-shaped cake on the kitchen table. 4, filled a basin with water to wash the blood from their hands. And 5, possibly spent time in the attic where a cigarette butt was found. In the stillness that followed the slaughter, the killer moved through the house with eerie composure, methodically covering mirrors with clothing as if to prevent them from reflecting the horrors that had just occurred. Washing blood from hands and the axe in a basin of water drawn from the Moore's kitchen pump, perhaps even consuming food from their pantry, leaving a piece of cake on a plate as if to mock the sanctity of the home. The murderer was in no hurry to leave, confident that the deed would remain undiscovered until the morning. In the attic, a cigarette glowed in the darkness as the killer waited, perhaps listening for any sound of alarm from the sleeping town. The discovery, horror in daylight. The morning of June 10th began like any other in Villisca. Mary Peckham rose early and began her daily chores. By 7 a.m, she noticed something unusual. The Moore house was silent, with no sign of activity. The chickens in the yard were unfed and making noise, something completely out of character for the punctual and responsible Moore family. After waiting until 8:30 a.m, Mary's concern grew. She attempted to open the front door, but found it locked from the inside. A sense of dread washing over her, she called Joe's brother, Ross Moore. Mary Peckham's hand trembled slightly as she gathered eggs from her hen house. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The Moore house stood silent across the yard, its curtains drawn. No smoke rose from the chimney, no sounds of children preparing for school. The Moore's family chickens paced restlessly in their coop, unfed and agitated. Mary approached the house, her footsteps hesitant on the front path. She knocked once, twice, called out Sarah's name. Only silence answered. The door was locked, unusual for a household that would normally be bustling with morning activity. Mary's heart raced as she stepped back, her eyes scanning the silent windows. She had lived next to the Moores for years, knew their routines as well as her own. Something was terribly wrong. The gruesome revelation. Ross Moore arrived shortly after Mary's call and used his own key to enter the house. What he discovered inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bodies of Josiah and Sarah Moore lay in their bed, their faces completely destroyed by repeated axe blows. Moving through the house in horror, Ross discovered the bodies of the 4 Moore children in their beds, each killed in the same brutal manner. Downstairs, in the room off the parlour, lay the Stillinger girls. Lena, the older sister, showed signs of having awakened during the attack. Her body was found in a defensive position, with evidence suggested that she tried to fight off her attacker. Ross Moore's hand shook as he inserted his key into the lock. The door swung open with an ominous creak, revealing a house shrouded in unnatural stillness. The air inside was thick with a metallic scent of blood. Ross called out his brother's name, his voice echoing through the silent rooms. No response came. He moved cautiously through the parlour, then froze at the foot of the stairs. Something darker dripped onto the steps from above, staining the wood. With growing horror, he ascended the staircase, each step creaking under his weight. At the top, he turned toward the master bedroom. The door stood ajar. What he saw inside turned his blood to ice. His brother and sister-in-law lay motionless in their bed, the white sheets now crimson with blood. Where their faces should have been was nothing recognizable as human. Ross staggered backward, a scream building in his throat that would never fully emerge. The aftermath, a town transformed. News of the murder spread through Villisca like wildfire. By mid-morning, hundreds of curious onlookers had gathered outside the Moore house, trampling potential evidence in their eagerness to glimpse the scene of the crime. Law enforcement was overwhelmed, and the crime scene was hopelessly compromised before proper investigation could begin. The mayor quickly called for assistance from neighbouring counties, and detectives from across the state converged on Villisca. The house was thoroughly searched, but crucial evidence had already been lost to the curious crowd. The murder weapon, an axe belonging to Joe Moore, was found in the guest room. Where the Stillinger girls had been killed wiped clean of fingerprints. By noon, the street outside the Moore house had become a sea of horrified faces. Neighbours clutched each other, weeping. Children stood wide-eyed at the edges of the crowd, sensing the magnitude of something beyond their understanding. Inside the house, investigators moved carefully through rooms, heavy with the scent of death. The killer had been methodical, leaving almost nothing behind. The axe, Joel Moore's own, had been wiped clean and left alongside the bodies of the Stillinger girls. A final act of morbid ceremony. Photographs were taken, measurements made, but the investigation was already compromised. Too many feet had crossed the threshold. Too many hands had touched what should have remained undisturbed. Suspects and theories. As the investigation progressed, several suspects emerged. Reverend Kelly, the strange travelling minister who had been in town for the Children's Day programme. Kelly would later be arrested twice for the murders, but was ultimately acquitted. Frank F. Jones, a prominent businessman who had a falling out with Joel Moore over business matters. Moore had worked for Jones for years before leaving to start his own implement store. William Blackie Mansfield, a suspected serial killer who may have been responsible for similar axe murders across the Midwest. Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims, but a man who had committed similar axe murders in neighbouring states. A transient killer. Some believe the murders were committed by a drifter passing through town, possibly connected to the railroad. As detectives pieced together the events of that night, suspicion fell on many. Reverend Kelly, with his strange demeanour and alleged confession, became a prime suspect. The small minister with the piercing eyes had been seen lurking near the Moore house before the murders, peering through windows at the children. Frank Jones, still bitter over Joe Moore's departure from his business, had both motive and means. And then there was Blackie Mansfield, a shadowy figure linked to similar murders across the Midwest. Each suspect brought their own shadows to the investigation, their own reasons for wanting the Moore family silenced forever. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, the truth remained elusive, hidden behind a veil of small-town secrets and compromised evidence. The lasting impact. The Villisca Axe Murders remained unsolved, a dark chapter in Iowa's history that would never be closed. The town of Villisca was forever changed, its innocence shadowed by the brutal killings. Houses that had once been left unlocked were now barred at night. Children who had once played freely in the streets were kept close to home. A sense of suspicion and fear settled over the community, never to fully dissipate. The Moore house itself became a morbid tourist attraction. Over the decades, stories of paranormal activity began to circulate. Visitors reported hearing children's voices, seeing shadowy figures, and feeling inexplicable cold spots throughout the house. Whether these experiences were genuine supernatural phenomena or the product of overactive imaginations influenced by the house's gruesome history remains a matter of debate. Villisca would never be the same. In the weeks following the murders, the population dwindled as families packed up and left, unable to live in the shadow of such horror. Those who remained installed locks on doors that had never before been secured. Parents kept their children close, eyeing strangers with newfound suspicion. The Moore house stood empty for years, a silent monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. When it finally sold, new owners found themselves plagued by nightmares and inexplicable occurrences. The laughter of children where no children lived, the sound of footsteps on the stairs in the dead of night, the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. More than a century later, the house still stands, drawing those fascinated by its dark history. Some say the victims remain, their spirits bound to the place where their lives were so violently ended, waiting for justice that never came. The unsolved mystery. More than a century has passed since that fateful night in June 1912. Yet the Villisca Axe Murders remain one of America's most chilling unsolved crimes. The case has been the subject of books, documentaries, and countless theories, but the truth may never be known. The Moore House still stands in Villisca, now restored to its 1912 appearance and open for tours. Those brave enough to visit, or even stay overnight, report unexplained phenomena. Some claim to have captured EVP recordings of children's voices, while others have felt unseen hands touching them in the dark. Whether these experiences are genuine encounters with the restless spirits of the victims or simply the power of suggestion at work in a place with such a terrible history remains unknown. What is certain is that the events of June 10, 1912 continue to fascinate and horrify us. A reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the veneer of small-town tranquility. As the sun sets over Villisca, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, the Moore House stands as it has for over a century, a silent witness to unspeakable horror. The children who once played in its rooms are long gone, their laughter silenced by an axe wielded in darkness. Yet something of them remains, trapped perhaps between worlds, unable to find peace until justice is served. Justice that may never come. The killer's identity has been lost to time, the evidence scattered to the winds. But the story endures, a cautionary tale of innocence lost and evil unpunished. And in the darkest hours of the night, when the wind whispers through the eaves of the old house, some say you can still hear them, 8 souls crying out for a resolution that eludes them still. The case of the Villisca Axe Murders reminds us that some mysteries are never solved, some wounds never fully heal. It stands as a testament to the fragility of human life and the darkness that can lurk in the human heart. In a town where everyone knew everyone else, a killer walked among them undetected until it was too late. And when the morning came, nothing would ever be the same again. Thank you for joining me for this episode of True Crime Tuesday Stories. I'll see you next time as we continue to uncover the dark truths hidden in the shadows of everyday life.